There's a certain paradox inherent to the gaming landscape, and it has to do with failure, which is something that we instinctively try to avoid. And yet, if we never experience failure, a game runs the risk of feeling hollow. Success is rarely satisfying if it doesn't feel earned, and if a game never gives the player any pushback, the end result can often be that the game feels too easy, causing the player to disengage. Some degree of friction is necessary to deliver the satisfaction of accomplishment. Moreover, the most exhilarating victories are often the ones where we're only a hair's breadth away from defeat. Unfortunately, there is a very fine line to walk between failure acting as a motivator, inspiring players to persevere, improve, and overcome, and failure being a frustration, something which can ruin our experience with a game outright if pushed to too far an extreme. The threat of failure can be more valuable than the experience of it. So today, I want to examine failure, how it works from a design perspective, ways that it can ruin the experience of playing a game, and ways that it has been implemented successfully. In short, how can games make failure fun? The first thing that is often brought up in this type of conversation is that the right amount of failure is going to be different for everybody. This is definitely true, and it is what makes games so difficult to balance. But while it's true that everyone will have a different tolerance for failure, it's more complex than that. Failure is not a uniform thing, and the same person won't experience it the same way every time. It's the context that surrounds failure that defines our relationship with it. I look at failure as a two-part process, the trigger and the consequence. The trigger being the root cause, and the consequence being the way that it impacts the player going forward. Broadly speaking, I think there are 4 triggers for failure, those being luck, skill, stats, and knowledge, and players will respond to each of them differently. From a design perspective, each trigger has its own strengths and weaknesses. Anytime a player loses because of something that was outside the scope of their control, they're going to attribute that failure to luck. Nobody likes feeling like they did the right thing and only lost because of a bad roll of the dice. This has the potential to be the most demotivating experience for a player and can even result in them quitting a game altogether. But play your cards right and players will keep coming back for another pull on the slot machine. A skill failure is the opposite of a luck failure. Missed the timing in a rhythm game? Skill issue. Can't land a single hit on your opponent? Skill issue. Died trying to style on a boss with an unnecessarily flashy move? Believe it or not, that's a skill issue. Skill failures are common and necessary for a healthy game. Building your skills and overcoming walls that once barred your progress is the whole appeal of a wide swath of games. But if it becomes too demanding, a player may just decide that it isn't worth the effort. A stat failure is when the player simply doesn't have the mechanical numbers necessary to overcome a hurdle. Regardless of how well they play, the possibility of success is narrow if the player doesn't have the raw stats. This may mean a fight is literally impossible, such as a scripted loss, or that it's designed to be returned to later with better equipment, more levels, or in a new game plus. Not everyone likes a grind, but overcoming stat checks is the appeal of genres from JRPGs to looter shooters. Knowledge failures occur when a setback comes from a player's lack of preparation or awareness of the mechanic. Knowledge failures are infrequent by comparison because they usually aren't repeated. The player will often learn the necessary information in the course of their failed first attempt, and if they don't, it's usually made pretty clear that they're missing something vital, prompting them to go elsewhere and find the information before returning to try again. Oh, you can shoot the crystals. We have to shoot the crystals. Otherwise the whole room's gonna zap and explode, I think. When done well, a knowledge failure motivates a player to continue exploring and experimenting, but done poorly, they leave a player feeling blindsided and feel just as unfair as a luck failure. These 4 triggers are not isolated. You can usually mitigate one potential failure trigger by bolstering another. For example, you can grind XP to outlevel a challenge and lessen the risk of a skill failure. On the flip side of that coin, if you devote enough time to master a game, you may be able to overcome its hardest challenges at level 1. Every game's format, pace, and general design philosophy will mean that the weight and frequency of each trigger will vary from game to game. The consequences of failure are much harder to categorize. They manifest in such a wide variety of ways and have such disparate impacts both between separate games and within a game itself. Some consequences are very small and temporary, impacting only a single interaction in the moment-to-moment gameplay experience, while some may be huge and permanent, such as the loss of a character or being locked into a bad ending. Very, very broadly speaking, I would say that the cost of failure can be broken down into time, resources, and opportunities. Time, meaning a player will have to retry the same challenge again. Resources, meaning a player will lose some in-game material that either can't be recovered or can be replaced through further time investment. And opportunities, meaning items, characters, or story paths become inaccessible to the player unless they're willing to invest the time into another playthrough of the game. And here you might be sensing a theme. Almost all setbacks in one way or another can be seen as costing you time, which is a resource that most of us already have precious little of. failure feels the most punishing and least rewarding when it causes players to feel like their time is being wasted. If you have family, work, or even other hobbies that you want to enjoy, you may not have an abundance of time to invest into a game, and failing repeatedly without any sense of reward or forward momentum is a quick way to drain the player of any enthusiasm they had for the experience. This is a big part of why many people, myself included, find it so easy to get sucked into the gameplay loop of roguelikes. For a first-time player in a roguelike, failure is not only expected, it is practically an inevitability. But due to variation in the abilities, map layouts, enemy placements, and other game mechanics which are randomized between each attempt, each run feels more like an opportunity for success and experimentation rather than a slog through content that's already been seen. It's very likely that the player will find something completely new for at least their first few runs, and even once they have seen most of what the game can offer, new combinations and build possibilities continue to keep the game feeling fresh. Couple that with the gradual improvement that the player sees as they continue playing, and each loss and subsequent retry instead becomes part of its own positive feedback loop. For roguelikes with a story, Hades being the prime example in my eyes, losing a run also serves as an opportunity to shift into a new phase of gameplay, one which is less focused on progression through execution and more focused on the progression of the narrative. It introduces a sort of buffer space between the moment of failure and the negative consequence, in this case, starting a new run. Separating those 2 points allows players a sort of mental reset that softens the blow a bit more than just immediately being shunted into a menu with a try again button. Returning to a central hub can also offer players an opportunity to spend resources on any form of meta progression that the game may offer, distinguishing the roguelike from the increasingly popular roguelite. Some roguelites, such as The Binding of Isaac or a personal favorite, Enter the Gungeon, will offer a horizontal meta progression. The player's stats are static, but the pool of items and abilities expands the more you play. Vertical progression instead upgrades the stats directly, making players stronger or more resilient. Both forms of progression turn a run's failure into an opportunity to cash in and improve your odds on your next attempt. All in all, this means that roguelites offer an experience that stays fresh and remains both challenging and rewarding. This isn't to say that it's a perfect formula by any means. Roguelites with vertical progression fall victim to a strange phenomenon wherein the player's skill increases while the game gets easier by virtue of the stat increases. The end result of this can be that a game becomes too easy and a player can end up outpacing the challenge of the game. Once again, the Hades games have a very elegant solution to this in their heat and fear systems, which allow players to pick additional challenge modifiers to apply to the runs, fine-tuning the gameplay experience to their preferred level of challenge. The Ascension system in the Slay the Spire games also comes to mind here. In both cases, it lets the player gradually advance to the level of challenge and, therefore, the risk of failure that appeals to them individually. But how do we handle failure in other genres, where the core gameplay loop doesn't make the same assumptions as the roguelike? Well, there is a word that we often use in games discourse to describe how frequently a player is likely to experience failure: difficulty. Players with a high tolerance for failure and a drive to seek out and overcome challenges can opt into higher difficulty levels, while players who are more risk-averse can choose difficulty options that make failure a less common occurrence, or in some cases, a less punishing one. We see difficulty settings at the beginning of most single-player games, and I want to make it clear up front that I don't categorically dislike difficulty options, but they do have their own set of potential issues that can hold games back. Traditionally, the options are broken down between easy, normal, and hard, and already we're seeing a potential flaw here. The word normal indicates that this is the baseline experience. This is the one that developers want you to pick. Those other ones, they're for babies and tryhards. Now, you can address this problem by choosing more creative names for the difficulty levels, but it's been baked into gaming culture long enough that most players will still make that assumption when choosing between rookie, soldier, and veteran or whatever. Someone playing a game for the first time also won't have a good idea of if a difficulty setting is too hard or too easy for them until they try it out, which can sometimes leave them locked into the difficulty selection they chose unless they restart the entire game. The normal difficulty is also going to be the mode that likely receives the most playtesting and balance considerations. And speaking of balance, many games simply make quantitative adjustments to the games at their higher difficulties, which is to say changes only to the numbers that make the game run, how much health enemies have and how much damage they do being the most common and frustrating implementation of this. Easy mode turning these numbers down is not much of an issue. I think anything that makes a game more accessible to players who need or prefer that is always a good thing. On the other hand, turning up the numbers in the hard hard experience often just turns the game into a slog. Encounters that take twice as long and lower your margin for error without impacting the way you choose to approach each situation often aren't rewarding, and it makes failing those encounters all the more frustrating. In this context, qualitative adjustments to the difficulty are often the better approach. Changes to the ways enemies behave, or the options available to a player. Failure on this type of hard mode can be easier to swallow because it often tells the player that they are missing an item, an ability, or the skill set necessary to overcome the challenge, and it encourages further exploration and engagement with the game. I do want to acknowledge with higher difficulty options that there is a sort of self-selection bias in the conversation. The people who opt into a high difficulty mode, especially the most extreme and brutal ones, likely already know the mechanics of the game and are comfortable with persevering through a challenging playthrough, and more willing to accept the consequences of failure. This also extends to games which are unforgiving by nature. Some devs want to make games that are brutal, and there is certainly an audience for that. For my favorite example of this, before you even start your save file, Darkest Dungeon offers players a warning that the game is difficult and that you will fail. This goes a long way because it immediately establishes expectations. Some players will bounce off of a game like this specifically because failures are both frequent and punishing. But with that expectation established, this game provides a fantastic experience for players who enjoy that type of oppressive tension. While it's true that many single-player games present players with a difficulty option, not all of them do. And in such cases, a greater consideration has to be placed on the impact that failure is going to have on the player experience. The classic consequence of failure, of course, is the dreaded game over screen, prompting the player to return to the very beginning and start over. As hardware allowed for more complex game design, gaming shifted to home consoles and PCs, and saving of game states between play sessions became possible, you became more likely to see the little brother of the game over screen, the load last save screen. This is still common in turn-based RPGs or similar genres, but this too has begun to fall out of favor in recent decades. More and more, games nowadays are opting to have some sort of persistent world, where instead of reverting to a previous save state, the player will carry on after a failure, adapting their next steps to the consequences. And I think you all knew it was coming, it's now time to talk about Dark Souls. Though it wasn't the first game to introduce the mechanic, it popularized the idea of the bloodstain. For anyone unfamiliar, in Dark Souls you accumulate souls, which can be spent like money at shops. You can go to any bonfire, the game's checkpoint system, and spend those souls like XP in order to level up. If you die at any point, you'll drop your unspent souls at the site of your death and respawn at your latest bonfire. You can recover your souls by returning to the spot that you died, but if you die again without picking them up, then those souls are gone for good. This mechanic has been copied and iterated upon all over the gaming landscape. If you see the Souls-like tag on Steam, there's a high chance that the game does some variation of this. It's a simple premise, but it serves a lot of functions that help shape the player's relationship with failure. For one thing, it softens the harsh blow, giving players the opportunity to undo the impact of a death, acting as a sort of buffer between a single failure and a permanent punishment. But most importantly, it introduces variance into the game. While exploring an area for the first time, the player is focused on a broad set of objectives, getting familiar with the map layout, learning new enemy patterns, finding secrets, or hunting loot. But once the player has died, recovering their souls becomes a new objective that supersedes the others, and it introduces a new question for the player. How do I want to approach this? Fundamentally, nothing has changed about the level. The enemy placement, traps, and such are all exactly the same as they were before. But now the player has to decide how they're going to achieve this new, much narrower goal. What resources are they willing to spend? Is it safer to methodically take out every enemy on the way, or to rush past them in a mad dash for your souls? Do you even remember the path you took to get there? It creates a completely new type of tension that only exists until the bloodstain is reached or the souls are lost. And this is the elegance of this system. Though there is the negative consequence of potentially losing progress towards your next level up, there is also the positive consequence of a dynamic change to the way that the player engages with the game. However, let's not pretend that the Dark Souls franchise has a flawless relationship with failure. For one thing, the threat of losing your souls is a compelling motivator. Actually losing your souls because you couldn't recover them can be discouraging, sometimes enough to make a player quit altogether. Sometimes your souls may be locked inside of a boss fight. Deciding not to fight a boss and explore elsewhere can feel like giving up, which is already a bad feeling for a lot of players. But giving up while an hour's worth of XP is sitting at the boss's feet is doubly discouraging. And this can lock players into an unproductive and frankly unfun cycle of feeding themselves into a meat grinder trying to challenge a boss that they're underprepared for. And then there's Dark Souls Souls 2. The bloodstain mechanic remains, but the developers made the utterly baffling decision to have every death also cost you a percentage of your maximum health, which can only be restored via a limited consumable. This punishment means that a player who struggles with a zone or a boss will return less capable of beating it the next time around. Resetting progress is one thing, but punishing the player by actively making it harder for them is brutally unforgiving, and it's no wonder this mechanic never made a return in FromSoft's future games. Another staple consequence of failure in the Souls franchise, as well as Metroidvanias and a myriad of other genres, is the run back. Opinions are divided on this particular subject, and though I am a person who enjoys runbacks conceptually, I'll admit that they are hard to do well and can often take away more than they add. In theory, it gives the player that buffer between their last failure and the next, helping to avoid the feeling that you're throwing yourself into a meat grinder of repeated failure and avoid causing the player to tilt. It can also serve as a fun breath of fresh air if it offers the player an opportunity for skill expression, such as is the case in movement-based platformers, which is part of the reason I enjoy them, especially in Hollow Knight. But far too often, the runback actually becomes the worst aspect of a failed run. If the player experiences too much friction during the runback, struggling too hard to even reach a boss that they will ultimately just die to again, it can feel like they're caught in a death spiral, in which they're spending a lot of time trying to beat a boss, but not being given the opportunity to practice against that boss and build the skills that they need to overcome it. Or worse, the runback can just be boring. If there is nothing at all for the player to engage with as they return from their last checkpoint to the boss fight, it begs the question, what was the point of all of this? Why not just put a checkpoint outside the boss room? If the only real consequence of losing is that I have to run for 2 straight minutes to get another try, how can that be seen as anything other than a waste of time? Switching gears for a moment, there is also another class of game that fundamentally has a different relationship with failure, the simulator, the king of which in this regard is Dwarf Fortress, where losing is fun is literally the game's motto. In this style of game, you guide a civilization from humble beginnings to glorious heights to inevitably a disastrous fall. There is no fixed win condition, only your own goals and creativity. There are of course a myriad of ways for things to go catastrophically wrong.
Oh my god, there are so many bears.
But whether you lost because of attacks from ancient beasts, elves invading, civil war, ghosts, or because the circus came to town, all you can do is enjoy the story that you've told, dust yourself off, and go again. This style of game won't appeal to everyone, but for the people who do play it, it's like arranging a beautiful row of dominoes. Setting it up is fun, but watching the beauty unfold as you knock them all down is the real joy of it. Some games can make failure more interesting by approaching it from a character or a narrative perspective rather than a mechanical one. For example, in Batman Arkham Asylum, dying causes you to reload from your last checkpoint. However, before you do, the villain who defeated you gets a moment to taunt you directly. It's a small touch, but the outlandish personalities and excellent voice acting means that every death is almost rewarded with a moment of extra character development. Though it has no mechanical impact, it causes the player to form a sort of relationship with the characters, which helps motivate them to return for revenge. Failure is also a lot of the fun of Disco Elysium, which features such a broad set of skills that you can't possibly be proficient in all of them, and failing your roles is inevitable, but the witty writing and outrageous results of failure are often more fun than the successes would be. In many ways, failure in Disco Elysium is not a worse result than success, merely a different one, allowing you to constantly fail forward into one of the most interesting games out there. And all of that brings us to the game that, in my opinion, handles failure the best. A game which turns failure into an opportunity to advance the narrative, one which incorporates the randomization that makes roguelikes compelling, a game that causes your failures to dynamically alter the gameplay experience, furthers your relationship with the characters, and introduces new goals to pursue. I am talking, of course, about Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, its sequel Shadow of War, and the Nemesis system. In these games, you play as Talion, a Deathwalker who faces off against Sauron's army of orcs. The army is populated by a hierarchy of procedurally generated individual orcs, each with their own personalities, strengths, and weaknesses. If you defeat a captain, for example, a new one may rise to take their place. Failure in this paradigm doesn't have to mean death. If your goal is to defeat an orc captain, failure may mean being forced to run away from the encounter, or it may mean coming close to winning but letting your target slip away. It may mean that you yourself are defeated, but the orc decides to humiliate you and walk away instead. It is even possible, though very rare, for you to grasp defeat from the jaws of victory as a blood brother swoops in to save your foe. Of course, sometimes you do actually just die. Regardless, the orc who defeated you will grow and change as a result of the encounter. They will level up, They may gain new strengths or outgrow their old weaknesses. They may change their name or their title to reflect their victory. And if they're feeling bold, they may challenge a captain, chief, or warlord in a bid to take over their position. Even a basic common orc can rise through the ranks if they prove themselves by beating you enough. All of this together means that no matter why you failed, no matter how or how frequently, it will serve as a springboard that propels your personal story forward. Your relationship with these orcs and what specific challenges you will face are all unique to your experience and defined by the failures that you face on your way to victory. At every possible turn within this framework, the player is kept on their toes, constantly questioning what will happen next and adapting to that answer, even and especially when the player fails. Unfortunately for all of us, Warner Bros. Currently holds a patent for the Nemesis system, which restricts other developers from implementing the same or similar systems in their own games. Although it's a shame that we don't get the opportunity to see this downright excellent piece of game design reimagined and iterated upon, we can at least look to it for inspiration on how to make failure fun. But maybe how can failure be fun is the wrong way to look at it. Because let's be honest, failing isn't fun, but it can lead to something fun. It can help us tell more engaging stories, become more invested in the world of the game. It can dynamically change the gameplay systems we interact with, and allow us to feel truly accomplished. So in games and in life, I hope that when you do fail, you try again, better and stronger, and walk away having done something you feel truly proud of. Thank you very much to the patrons over at Patreon for helping make these videos possible. You can support from only $2 a month, the link is in the description. And thank you to everyone who has made it this far in the video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject down in the comments. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!